We have two speakers today, and I want to thank them on behalf of the City Club for responding to our invitation. These gentlemen have debated more than once and discussed this issue. Last week they were at the City Club of Portland. I think that their arguments are sharpened, and we benefit, I think, from those previous arguments. They know one another well. I don't know if they buy one another drinks or not, but then not so. Paul Stanford is the chief petitioner for Measure 80. He founded and manages the nation's largest medical marijuana clinic. He serves as a court expert witness on marijuana and has made numerous media appearances as well as producing a variety of media products. Josh Marquis is the district attorney of Clatsop County, Oregon. He's a distinguished in his professional organization service at both the state and the national levels, and he's a frequent guest on national radio, television programs in discussing the criminal justice programs and society. So that sets you up. The drill, again, is that we will start with Paul Stanford, who will give you 7 minutes of his best shot explaining Measure 80, and from that we will go to Josh. Paul?
Good afternoon, Salem City Club members and civic leaders and esteemed guests. Proud to be here this afternoon to represent Measure 80, which is a historic opportunity for Oregon and the nation to bring sensible thinking to the issue of how we interact with and manage the marijuana market. I'd like to start with a piece of history that helps us understand the situation. Back in 1932, Oregonians voted to end the failed policy of alcohol prohibition. Oregonians personally understood that regardless of whether they consumed alcohol or even supported the alcohol industry's existence, alcohol wasn't going anywhere, and prohibition was the worst way to deal with it. So they changed their mind and decided to regulate alcohol. Note that I said 1932. Federal prohibition of alcohol wasn't overturned until 1933. And many in the status quo movement said that Oregon couldn't possibly move first and expect the federal government to follow. But follow they did. Bring us to today. In 2010, Oregon's wine industry is a nearly $3 billion a year industry, employing more than 10,000 men and women with jobs in agriculture, food, processing, marketing, finance, and retail services. And Oregon's beer industry is more than $2 billion a year, employing thousands, bringing and keeping money in our state. These same industries were once illegal and are now the pride of our state, and not because of some miraculous cosmic shift or because the federal government acted first. It's because Oregon voters saw that what we were doing wasn't working, and they were willing to do something different. In that spirit of acknowledging the facts and using common sense, Oregon's Measure 80 simply says that marijuana prohibition has failed in Oregon and across the nation, and we have an opportunity to fix it. It's a long-standing failure. We can regulate a market that isn't going anywhere and create jobs, new tax revenue, and a sensible policy. Oregon Measure 80 will regulate marijuana like liquor for adults 21 years of age or older, with sales only through state licensed stores. And with tough DUI penalties we already have in place, our initiative will fund development of tests to detect marijuana more readily. When alcohol prohibition was ended, of course, there were no breathalyzer tests. And today we see we have numerous ways to detect alcohol. Measure 80 also introduces tough penalties, like felony charges for people who sell marijuana to minors, criminal misdemeanor charges for providing marijuana to minors, rules against consuming marijuana in public, just like alcohol is illegal, rules against taking it out of state that are more severe for people who are doing it on a commercial scale. It also limits the amount of marijuana that a person can purchase at any given time and over a period of time to discourage the illegal export. Measure 80 will also save Oregon tens of millions of dollars a year in public safety costs associated with enforcement of the failed marijuana laws, from police costs to court costs and jail costs, which means our cities and counties will have more of their budgets to focus on dangerous substances and dangerous offenders. Opponents of this sensible policy like Measure 80 want you to believe that the world will end, that the problem isn't that bad, that we can't possibly move forward ahead of the federal government. But they're wrong. When the states lead, the federal government will follow. And even our opponents won't tell you that the most important thing in this debate, they won't tell you that what we're doing now isn't working, or it is working, because it isn't working. Another argument you'll hear from the defenders of the failed status quo is that we don't have a marijuana policy failure here in Oregon. We have medical marijuana. We decriminalized marijuana, as Ed noted, in 1973. I'm here to tell you that those arguments don't really hold water, and here's why. As long as prohibition is the law of the land, Oregon medical marijuana patients, providers, and even our frontline law enforcement officers will always operate in a confusing web of conflicting state and federal laws. And while decriminalization was a necessary step, it's not sufficient, because decriminalization does nothing to diminish the marijuana black market. As long as marijuana is illegal, it'll be profitable and people will break the law to grow it, sell it, and get it to consumers. But when we end prohibition, and it's not really a question of if we're going to end prohibition, because it is going to end eventually. People like me aren't going anywhere. We're going to demand our freedom. But when we end it, marijuana, like other legal regulated markets, will become transparent, legitimate, and competitive. Regulating marijuana is not impossible, it's inevitable. Our state government regulates practically every industry because the alternatives don't work. Total deregulation is a bust. You can ask our neighbors in California what they thought of the deregulated energy industry. Prohibition doesn't work. We can ask the millions of Americans who are incarcerated simply for using or growing or selling marijuana. So how will we regulate marijuana with Measure 80? We'll establish an industry commission made up of 7 members. The first year, all 7 of those members will be appointed by the governor, by Governor Clatsop. And they'll come from the agricultural industry, the medical community, the legal field. Maybe you've read the Oregonians editorial board statement on Measure 80 and have questions about the commission. Maybe the Oregonians tried to scare you by using terms like marijuana grower. Well, let me tell you this. Are you scared of grass seed growers that dominate the grass seed industry? Are the Christmas tree growers that dominate the Christmas tree industry? I think a better term might be gardeners. The fact is, illegal marijuana growers don't want Measure 80 to pass. They love to see Measure 80 fail because Measure 80 will cripple the black market and bring legitimate legal competition to the marketplace. When we repeal prohibition and regulate marijuana sensibly, Oregonians will have businesses, jobs, invest in the community, and restore hemp for fuel, fiber, and food. That's why I believe the biggest opportunity when we pass Measure 80 is the reality is Oregon farmers will be the biggest beneficiaries. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me and allowing me to drive these 7 hours to and from Astoria today. Forgive me if my voice is a little rough. I got a bit of a cold. I want to make clear that I don't consider marijuana the demon weed. And I want to go back a little bit to that history because it's very important. In 1973, marijuana was decriminalized. In Oregon, all crimes are called offenses. There's 3 categories of them: felonies, for which you can go to prison; misdemeanors, for which you can go to jail; and infractions, for which you cannot go to jail. And if ever asked a question, have you ever been convicted of a crime, you can answer no. Speeding tickets or infractions. Marijuana, the man who did it was a guy named Pat Horton, who's long since retired from political life. He was my boss. He was the Lane County District Attorney in Eugene, and he did something really radical in 1973. And it was the kind of thing, with all due respect, Paul was way too young then anyway, but it was something that frankly only a law enforcement person probably could have gotten away with, which was to step forward and say, this is crazy, when we have people, and the idea, the law since then, and I did not support, by the way, the recriminalization in 1997. It's one of the reasons it was defeated so soundly, as very few law enforcement supported it. I think it was a stupid idea. The idea of decriminalization that Pat came up with in '73, and I wrote many of his speeches, and it was considered totally radical in the United States at the time, it's been picked up, was that the casual and incidental use of marijuana was radically different than the use of other drugs like heroin and methamphetamine, which wasn't that common then except in biker gangs, and cocaine. And that when young people at college at the University of Oregon, which dominates Eugene, were arrested for possession of a couple joints, they faced felony charges. That could ruin their life. I mean, they couldn't become lawyers or baker, I mean anything that required registration. So with that interesting, diversion, I've forgotten about the 1997 attempt. It did get crushed. But that's very important that Oregon for almost 40 years now has decriminalized marijuana. And an ounce, I can't resist. I see several golden marijuana leaves in the audience, and Paul showed up with a bit of a posse, and he's got signs over here. I know I got nobody with me. Just before you've had a chance, could I just get a sense by raising your hands, how many of you, before you've heard both of us finish speaking, support Measure 80? Just raise your hand if you support Measure 80. About 2/3, would you say, Paul? Okay. All right. Okay. And let me ask another question, and I'll try not to be too boring. How many of you, I won't have a chronic condition of some kind for which you either do take medication or could if you wanted to? Okay. You're all eligible for an Oregon medical marijuana card, if you don't have one already. In fact, an Oregon medical marijuana card is easier to get than a driver's license. And the one thing I think Paul and I will agree on is that the medical marijuana is a disaster. It's the one thing that Oregonians are a compassionate people, and I believe it's absurd that marijuana is scheduled as a Schedule I drug. It should be a Schedule II drug. I've been advocating this for over 8 years. Doctors should prescribe it. It should be available in pharmacies, and growers like Paul and other people can grow really good weed. When I was at the University of Oregon in the 1970s, I'm very nostalgic about the smell of marijuana. It reminds me of going around the University of Oregon campus where I used to smell it frequently. But the marijuana that my friends smoked back then, and I didn't mainly because I worked in the DA's office and I thought it was hypocritical, was 2% THC. It's tetrahydrocannabinol 9, by the way, is how it's pronounced. Paul could do me one better, I'm sure, as a grower. That marijuana was about 2%. If you had to mostly smoke a joint in order to get high, get a buzz. Now the marijuana that's being grown is 20 to 30% THC. I mean, you're talking about literally 1,000% more potent. Now, Paul's argument is, oh, you'll just use less of it. Unfortunately, in alcohol, that doesn't usually work. We don't usually find people going, oh, well, this is a much stiffer drink, so I'll just only have one of them. They have more. There are a number of problems with the Oregon Medical Marijuana Act. One is that it just blows the doors off legalization. I mean, Mr. Lesage talked about the medical marijuana, and I think the one thing that Paul makes clear is this has nothing to do with medical marijuana. In fact, I believe he called it a failed system, and I would agree. You have 55,000 recipients. Anybody can have 1.5 pounds of marijuana. Do you have any idea how much dope that is? And if you, by the way, drop down to just 1 pound, and in an emergency, then you can stock back up to 1.5 pounds, which means you can stay stoned 24/7, probably 30 days out of the month. So all you'd have to do is go to a doctor, and not every doctor will do this, and say, Josh Marquis' bad knees could, benefit from marijuana, and then I take that card and I go to a marijuana grower who may or may not be in it for the money, and that person and I can possess 1.5 pounds. The Oregonian did several very interesting news articles about some of the real outrages. For example, drug dealers are prohibited, but not sex criminals from being involved in it. So you have there's a lot of misuse of it. if we're to do something, what we need to do is convince the federal government to reschedule marijuana. I'm just looking at the Huffington Post, most recent article that talked about the conviction of a guy who sounds, I'm not trying to scare Paul, much like Paul. His name is, he probably knows him, Chris Williams in Montana, who was just convicted. It was the largest grower of dispensaries. They have a law similar to the one in Oregon. A federal jury just convicted him. He's going to prison. Now, I don't think that's right, but that's the federal law. And the article in the Huffington Post basically was asking President Obama, who's running for re-election, and it said, since then, the administration, meaning the Obama administration, has unleashed an interagency cannabis crackdown that goes beyond anything seen under the Bush administration, with more than 100 raids, primarily on California pot dispensaries, many of them operating in full compliance with state law. Since October 2009, the Justice Department has conducted more than 170 aggressive SWAT-style raids in 9 medical marijuana states. So make no mistake, when you're messing with the federal supremacy clause, you're not just going to say, oh, well, you know, they'll just go away because we'll show them the way. And the comparison to the Volstead Act is foolish. Remember what that was. You had liquor, which was an absolutely legal substance manufactured everywhere, that all of a sudden got made illegal. It was a wildly unpopular act, and it was a complete disaster. Marijuana has been illegal pretty much since 1937 and before then. So, and also, lastly, this marijuana commission he's talking about, 5 of the 7 members are required to be marijuana growers.
And now 2 questions, and we will time our speakers 2 minutes each, and I will start with Paul. And this is the question. If you agree that it is useful and desirable that THC be reclassified as a federal Schedule II drug, then what is the best way to proceed to effect this change? And I've asked the speakers, they suggested they can sit and respond. Paul?
I think the other substances in the Schedule II are a little bit just not on.
All over again.
I don't know if that's
Testing. I'm going to ask for this. Hold it down. Hold it down? Okay. Huh? We're in business.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
There we go.
You can hear that now?
Yep.
All right. I don't think cannabis should be Schedule II. I think if it's going to be scheduled, it should be Schedule 4 or 5. All the other substances in Schedule II can be toxic. Cannabis is not toxic. There's no lethal overdose. They have a regimen where they test drugs, and they have what they call LD50. That's a lethal dose for 50% of the people who take it. All the other substances that are in Schedule II have an LD50. For instance, there are a lot of substances that are lethal without being in Schedule II. If you take 13 aspirin, you're going to die, on an average. So cannabis, I believe, should be, if it's going to be scheduled, Schedule 4 or 5. So I think that it should be regulated like Measure 80 recommends.
You're on. You can just
It's
talk.
working now? Okay. You know, dream on. I understand a marijuana grower would say it's, you know, Tylenol is an incredibly toxic drug. If you take too much of it, it will destroy your liver. In fact, it's a real serious problem. You can buy buckets of it wherever you want without any. The LD50, by the way, is, thank God it's never done with human beings. LD50 testing on drugs is done on animals, whether that's offensive or not. I agree. I mean, marijuana, I don't think marijuana ever killed anybody unless a big bale fell over and hit them. But if we're going to be realistic, with the Obama administration kicking down doors in California, let's agree on something reasonable and something that we can actually sell, which is like saying, okay, this is a drug. which I think Paul calls relatively non-addicting. I'm sorry, I know people who are still on the same couch at the U of O in the same blue haze they were that when I left in 1980. Now, you know, they're not doing that much harm, but it is a drug.
Okay, second question. How would the passage of these measures, of Measure 80, affect the cultivation and sale of in Oregon by foreign drug cartels?
Foreign drug cartels would not be involved in it at all. It would license farmers, gardeners to grow cannabis. It would equitably distribute the licenses among all applicants, so no one large farmer would dominate the market. It would impose strict penalties for growing it illegally without a license or providing it to minors. We designed this to be upheld in federal court, and so it's designed to go through a process much like our Death with Dignity law that passed in 1994, was enjoined in the federal courts. It went through a fast track and came before the United States Supreme Court in 1996, and they upheld it in Gonzalez versus Oregon. We designed this law to be upheld in federal court in three ways. First, we impose a system of controls that's mandated by the Single Convention Treaty. The license requirements are directly lifted from international treaties. The first third of the text are findings by the people that are the sovereign, the rulers in our system. So the Supreme Court would have to take that into consideration. And so we designed it to deal with the federal issue, and we funded that through applicants' license fees. So people who buy a license to cultivate, process, or sell marijuana, those licenses would be used to defend the act, and it wouldn't come out of the general fund.
Well, let me give you a little anecdote. For 15 years, I'm still on the board of the National District Attorney Association. I represented Oregon. And one of my trips to the DEA center down in Tucson, which tries to regulate the border, where massive amounts of all kinds of drugs come over. I was in a big warehouse where coyotes bring over illegal aliens and not only make them pay $2,000, but now make them often wear a pack made of burlap of marijuana. And I was poking around with some other prosecutors, and a DEA agent walked up to me and said, and I was obviously sort of turning up my nose at the quality of the dope, and he was saying, "Where are you from?" I said, "I'm from Oregon." "Why?" He says, well, I said, "Where's this stuff going?" He says, "Not to the Pacific Northwest." And the point is, the marijuana, and it's a huge, the cartels will smuggle anything. Heroin, methamphetamine is actually their biggest crop by far, and marijuana. But the marijuana that's grown in Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, and California is far, far better. Also, on the Death with Dignity Act, that is a complete red herring. I was very supportive both times of the idea. The Death with Dignity Act was where Alberto Gonzales, Bush's first Attorney General, tried to get in between doctors and a drug that is currently a Schedule II drug, sodium pentobarbital, usually, which is the drug that if somebody passes the qualifications can be administered and they can end their own life. This is a drug that is outside of a doctor's ability to prescribe.
Now comes even more fun. Speaker A gets to ask Speaker B a question, and Speaker B responds. Paul, a question to Josh, and Josh, you have 2 minutes, and then Paul has a rebuttal. Yes, that's right.
Under the current approach, which combines regulation with education and enforcement, according to the Monitoring the Future study in 2012, alcohol and tobacco use among teens is now at a historic low, while the use of marijuana is at a historic high. With that information in mind, do you really believe that prohibition is a more effective model than regulation and control?
I don't necessarily think the current model is the best one, but the only reason that marijuana is so widely available now is primarily because of the so-called medical marijuana program, and that you have so many people that are able to possess such a large quantity of it, and the fact that it's a weed. Unlike tobacco, OxyContin, vodka, homebrew. I mean, yes, you can make homebrew. It's a lot of work. You can make wine. It's a lot of work. Anybody can grow marijuana. You don't need a lot of work.
Rebuttal.
It takes quite a few months to grow marijuana. It's not that easy to grow. Many medical patients fail in their crop. The weather greatly affects it. The same that microbrewers, they brew at home or make their own wine, aren't out in the streets trying to sell it. We won't see illegal growers selling marijuana when we regulate it. We used to have to worry about going and hiking in the hills back during alcohol prohibition because there were stills out there and moonshiners might shoot you. These days you have to worry about hiking up in the mountains and hills if marijuana growers are up there. We need to regulate this market. You know, people can grow their own tobacco, but I've never known anyone who's actually done that. And the brewers I know who make their own beer have to continue to buy it at stores, and it's regulated.
Now my turn?
Now you get to ask Paul a question.
All right, time for, my gross income is $113,000 a year. I'm employed by both the state and the county. That amount does not go up or down depending on how many marijuana busts or heroin busts or anything else. I'd like to ask Paul what his gross income is and how it's related to the sale and cultivation of marijuana and hemp.
My gross income is $85,000 a year through the clinics where our doctors help patients get a medical marijuana license. I grow medical marijuana and I give it away for free under Oregon's medical marijuana law. Our initiative would regulate that and would mandate that cannabis be sold to medical patients untaxed. I think the price will come down to $10, $20 an ounce. And the taxed marijuana, instead of its current value of $200 to $400 an ounce, will come down to $50 to $100 an ounce. The difference will be state revenue. So I employ a lot of doctors that make a lot more than I do.
Paul's foundation used to be nonprofit. That nonprofit status was taken away because it was determined that he was paying for apparently personal expenses. And I believe he's facing, although I think he's fighting at a $64,000 fine from Kate Brown's office. So,
there was another marijuana initiative that was fined $65,000. They did not make the ballot. That was initiative number 24. And I have not been fined by the Secretary of State. And that was another initiative. Unfortunately, it's pretty easy to confuse who knows how many marijuana initiatives there are. Ours was the one that qualified.
I'm going to give you 10 seconds if you want to. All right, that's it. The honorable gentleman ceded to the other honorable gentleman. That's the way. Isn't that wonderful? Anyway, let us now move to closing remarks. I'll ask Paul to begin. He has 2 minutes, and then Josh has 2 minutes. Gentlemen.
All right. The number one reason that Americans have suffered through 40 years of this failed war on marijuana is not because of public safety. It's because for 40 years we've been told that even to question the sanity of what we're doing is shameful and unpatriotic. But after trillions of dollars wasted and countless lives ruined, we can no longer really be intimidated. We have to stand up and say what we're doing is failed and we need a new approach. When we talk about reforming our laws, we're often told, what message are we sending our kids? Well, what message are we sending our kids? It's spending more and cutting on jails and cutting education, forcing more parents and students alike to go into debt for school while we continue to lock up more people in prisons for nonviolent offenses. You know, right now we have more people in jail in this country than any country in the history of the world, not just currently, but any other country. About twice the number of people are imprisoned here than are imprisoned in Russia. And it's easier for kids to get marijuana than it is to get liquor. Why? Because we regulate liquor. We educate about liquor. Alcohol use is at a historic low as a result of regulation and education, which is exactly what we will do with Measure 80, regulate and educate. Currently, 8 out of 10 kids in Oregon say marijuana is easy to get, and 3 out of 10 kids say alcohol is easy to get. And street dealers don't ask for ID. 8 out of 10 have access to drug dealers that don't ask for ID. That's what prohibition has done. So here's what Measure 80 does. It takes an extensive market that's prevalent now and brings it under state control, directs the money from the tax revenue for marijuana sales toward education in the general fund. It creates drug treatment programs with 7% of the proceeds and a comprehensive realistic drug education program with 1%.
Thank you.
I'd like to bring us back to reality in Oregon where you get to vote. We don't get to vote on federal law. Maybe we should, but we don't. This is an Oregon ballot measure. I urge you to read it. In fact, I urge you to go to his website. That's where I printed it off of. Read the initiative. It says that hemp and marijuana is the best thing since anything. I mean, hemp, it will cure your lumbago, your impotence, whatever it is, hemp and marijuana will do that for you. Now, he can say that there's all this money being spent on law enforcement. There are 14,500 people in prison in Oregon. You know how many are there for possessing marijuana? 6. And they're all plead downs from manufacturing. In Oregon, as we talked about, possession of less than an ounce, you can't even get arrested. I mean, it's not, you never get a record. Most marijuana possession charges, the judge is maxed out at 10 days in jail as a maximum fine under Oregon sentencing guidelines. When you look at the 50 states in this country, the #1 state in terms of the smallest percentage of nonviolent offenders in prison is Oregon. #1. We have 68% of those in prison are violent offenders. We literally can't be better than any other state. So this idea that this is a solution in search of a problem. I didn't come here today and tell you it's unpatriotic to do what Paul's doing or that marijuana is the devil weed. This is just a highly flawed solution. It doesn't say how much marijuana can be kept by any one of these distributors. It doesn't say what the tax is going to be, and there's no enforcement structure like there is all the CCTV. Now, he may say, oh, well, don't worry, the legislature will fix that. You would never tolerate that if I brought a sentencing initiative to you and said, let's lock everybody up for 2 years, and they say, oh, don't worry, you can fix it with the legislature later.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. And our spirited debate will, I think, become even more spirited because now it's time to take questions from the audience. 2 points. First of all, do use the microphone. The reason we need you to do that is so that we can get your question on the CCTV broadcast. And the second thing is no speeches, cut to the chase, ask the question, and that allows others to get their turn as well as it allows these gentlemen to understand what you're asking. So, questions? Go ahead.
David Hingham, City Hall. Hemp fiber used to be a wonderful resource for anything. The Royal Navy used it extensively when they were a sailing navy, and I'm wondering how useful would hemp fiber be today, and could we just use it and still disregard the marijuana?
Let me answer first, because my answer will probably be quicker and easier. Yes, you could. Male hemp, I think Paul can address this better than I, he's a grower, he knows it, is a basically doesn't have very much THC in it. And yes, hemp itself is a very useful substance. It could be used for all kinds of things. Female marijuana or female hemp is marijuana, and it can, depending on how it's grown, have a considerable THC content.
According to the law, the stems and sterile seeds of cannabis or marijuana is legal, and that's hemp. but the leaves and the flowers and the viable seeds are illegal, and that's marijuana. Oregon, in the 2007 legislative session, passed a bill put through by Assistant DA down in Lane County, Floyd Przansky. He'd been working on it for over a decade.
Floyd hasn't been an assistant DA for 25 years, let's be clear on that.
Okay. Anyway, that bill went through, but the only way we can cultivate cannabis or industrial hemp is to grow dwarf hemp, which produces half the amount of fiber and 1/20th the amount of seed, oil, and protein. In Canada, they're allowed to grow this dwarf hemp, and it produces about 600 pounds of seeds per acre. There's a study on feral hemp here in the United States that shows that the wild hemp that grows along the Mississippi and Ohio river valleys produces about 8,000 pounds of seed per acre. In Canada, the seed is the crop that they're growing it for, the seed oil and the seed protein. You can find hemp seed oil and hemp foods in stores all across America. It's a $1 billion a year crop, but it is not allowed to be produced here in the United States. So our initiative says that the varieties of cannabis that produce the most and the best hemp, seed oil, protein, and fiber, will be the ones that will be cultivated. So we believe that that will dwarf the drug market, that when we restore hemp in Oregon, we'll put Oregon on the cutting edge of exciting new sustainable developments. And I truly believe that hemp biodiesel fuel will be a main product that our farmers will get in on the ground level of. The whole reason that marijuana was prohibited wasn't really about drugs. You know, if they'd said they want to prohibit hemp, they never would have been able to do it. If they'd said they want to prohibit cannabis, the AMA came at the last minute and tried to stop, because they stopped the prohibition law that passed the federal government in 1937, because they didn't realize that marijuana was cannabis. So the only way they made it illegal was by using this new word, marijuana, and it was mainly to suppress the hemp fuel and hemp fiber markets. Henry Ford was producing auto bodies with hemp fiber and hemp oil, and the petrochemical companies didn't want to compete with that. So I really believe, and I think history will prove, that the main reason marijuana is illegal is to suppress hemp fuel and fiber.
Thank you.
Let me be clear, if this was about hemp production, I wouldn't be up here debating it. I really could care less about whether or not hemp is produced. And I apologize if I flared a little bit, but Floyd Przansky is not an assistant district attorney. He was for about 2 years in the late 1980s and early 90s. That's the last time I talked to him. Yes, well, Floyd is the marijuana person's favorite ex-district attorney. He has stood in front in ads in every single marijuana campaign for the last 25 years. So I apologize if I jumped a little bit at that one.
Next question.
Iris Gibson, Salem City Club. My question is about the Oregon Cannabis Commission, which is put in charge of this measure. It puts commercial pot growers and producers in charge of the commission established to regulate them. And after the first year, 5 of the 7 members of the commission will be chosen by them. And I don't understand why this is this way.
Thank you.
When we go to the Board of Pharmacy, there are pharmacists that are in charge of the Board of Pharmacy. When we go to the Oregon Medical Association, there are doctors who are mandated to be there. The law on agricultural commissions here in Oregon is that 70% of their composition has to be made up of people in the industry. You know, at first when we drafted this law, we were going to put it under the control of the Oregon Liquor Control Commission. We did polling and showed there's a certain percentage of people who believe the OLCC is corrupt and that they would never put anything under their control. So we decided to create a separate commission. And you know, the OLCC, by the way, is entirely political appointees. And there's that feeling out there that they don't do that good a job of it. I don't know if I agree with that, but there are certain people who do.
Josh?
I think the questioner has a good point. I think it's absurd. Look, marijuana is not blueberries or filberts. Yeah, I mean, marijuana is a drug. I would not be driving 7 hours from Astoria to say, hey, think about this law if we were talking about, some new exotic berry that they were going to grow. This is not an agricultural product. It's a drug. And like all drugs, it can be used and without terribly much harm, and it can be abused. And I don't know where Paul gets. I'm very much on the ground level of enforcement. I'm in court every day, and I see alcohol abuse by our young people at a really distressing rate. I learned at a Rotary meeting recently that in my community that something like 30% of 11th graders have engaged in binge drinking in the last 30 days from the study, which I find absolutely horrifying. So, and I want to use that as an example. There's a regulated industry, alcohol, and what a great job we've done at keeping alcohol from kids. I don't think anybody can really look at an audience and say, look at what a great job we've done at keeping alcohol out of the hands of kids.
Okay. Next question.
Hi, I'm Gloria Holland, City Club member. I understand from your comments that what I'm going to ask has to go to the legislature, but certainly you must have some idea of how much revenue would come to the state of Oregon through the regulation, taxation, et cetera, with the legalization, with this passage of this measure. Thank you.
I have a degree in political economy, but I haven't really studied the issue that in depth. There's a gentleman at Harvard University, a professor there by the name of Jeffrey Myron. You can see his website, prohibitioncosts.com. And he says here in Oregon that we will see income from the profit from selling cannabis of about $140 million a year, and that it costs about $61.5 million a year to enforce cannabis laws. That includes for possession. He mentioned that it's just an infraction with no jail time to have 28 grams or less of marijuana, but when you have 29 grams or more, then that is a felony. In fact, in his county, so far this year, they've had 16 felony arrests for possession of over an ounce of marijuana. Last year, there were 20 total in 2011. Here in the state, there are about 200 arrests per month for possession of over 28 grams of marijuana. So we anticipate that we'll bring in about $200 million a year. That represents about 5% of the total state budget. And here in Oregon, we have 2,400 possession arrests for over 28 grams, and another 4,500 arrests for selling or growing marijuana illegally. So we'll see a reduction in those costs and revenue.
I think it's very significant that there is not numbers in the I mean, generally speaking, if you have an industry, you can tell approximately whether it's wine or beer or filberts how much money is going to be generated, and that's one of the many things that's missing from here. Also, we have no idea what the tax rate is, how it's going to be enforced. They're going to be cannabis agents. Are they all going to be working for Paul? I mean, it's a whole bunch of this stuff. The idea that Paul at the last debate attributed $1 million of that cost to my county. My entire budget is $1.2 million. And I won't do this again because I can only get away with it like once. I think I handed him a $10 bill, which is the amount that I'm sure that my office spends aggressively going after marijuana possession. The fact of the matter, this is Oregon. For the most part, marijuana arrests are when cops trip over people, or one case that I personally prosecuted, somebody was growing way more plants than they should have, than they had a right to, in a place that they shouldn't. The sheriffs went up twice, said, please get your plants down. No. They refused. On the third time we prosecuted them. I just do not see this as the harsh, world that he's trying to paint of all these people being thrown in jail.
Gentlemen and audience, we have run out of time for the formal program, so what I'd like to do is, first of all, to thank both of our presenters and for coming here, 7-hour drive, which probably seemed like a lot longer, 4-hour drive. I was going to ask you about that, actually. I know there's other questions in the audience, and so what we will do is we will turn the podium over to Russ, and then after his remarks, we will take questioning up for a few minutes afterwards. Russ?
Thank you very much. And from the City Club's perspective, again, thank both of you gentlemen for being here today. And this will end our formal presentation for the CCTV. On a personal note, on the conflict of interest front, when I was a kid, my folks both smoked, and it made me sick, actually, the smoke in the house. They later quit, but at a very early age, I developed a philosophical objection to putting a burning object in my mouth. And I retain that to this day. I don't know if that gives me a conflict of interest or if it absolves me from a conflict of interest, but either way, I wish to declare that.